Hi everybody, I'm Richard from Civil War Seattle. I am here with Chris Makowski from Emerging Civil War, doing a little West Coast swing, so to speak, and we're here today in Seattle's Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery, a unique historic treasure for Civil War history, but also our regional and local history here in Seattle. It's an exclusive cemetery just to Union veterans of the American Civil War and their families. Some 500 approximately veterans are buried here with an incredible, diverse history that covers almost anything in the Civil War. As you look through these gravestones, you walk from one to the next. It's an Iowa soldier and a New York cavalryman and a Wisconsin soldier and a Navy sailor. It's a really remarkable place, and I hope over time coming with Emerging Civil War that I'll be able to introduce you more to these stories and the stories of Civil War veterans in Seattle in general and their importance, but remembering and sharing these kind of places with you guys so far removed from the Civil War.
So what brings people to Seattle as veterans? Why here?
Well, general westward migration, I think, is the quickest answer to that. Seattle specific has some interesting dynamics that separate it out from maybe why veterans wound up in California or Montana or elsewhere in Washington. In fact, the numbers of them initially in the wake of the war were pretty small. By 1880, 15 years after the war, there's only about 75 veterans, just 2 or 3 rows in the cemetery that even are residents here. But as this city explodes in population in the late 1880s, after the arrival of the Transcontinental Railroad, population here explodes. 1,100% increase in that decade alone of the city population. And they're migrating from the East, but the Midwest, especially what are now Midwestern states. So a lot of these men, as you go through here, there'll be a New York soldier who didn't come from New York to Seattle right after the Civil War. He came from Kansas or Montana or Nebraska or Michigan, where he had lived for 15 or 20 years, where he homesteaded and was married and began his family and his career. And then later, as Seattle exploded in economic opportunity and the railroads drove migration further west, that's kind of what fuels their arrival here in Seattle. And ultimately, there's about 3,500 veterans, plus all their families that reside here. But it's decades after the Civil War.
And obviously that sense of identity as Union soldiers really helps drive them to want a space for themselves.
Yeah, it does. And I think a lot of them too is they sought to establish themselves after the war in the late 1860s or 1870s. They do that, but as westward momentum is continuing in those through the 1870s and 80s, I think a lot of those that wind up here are looking for a long-term stability because they arrive here with families and careers, and I guess sort of a vision of you know, the kind of place that they want to really set down long-term roots that are different than perhaps where they originally thought, you know, in Kansas or in Nebraska, that didn't quite offer what this place was going to offer. So this looked like another destination where maybe they really could finish that sort of mission for themselves and their future and their families and that stability, economic opportunity, and so on.
Now, you've explained to me that this cemetery has had kind of a troubled past.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
Briefly, why has this hidden gem been such had such problems?
It's always, I think the core issue is who's taking care of this place. I think that's really what underpins a lot of its tumultuous history. So it was established in 1896. December 31st, 1895. In fact, the city council approves it. The mayor of Seattle signs off on it. That in and of itself begins controversy because the people that live on the properties around here see that the cemetery gets approved and the plat gets approved in the middle of the night on New Year's Eve, and they didn't know it was coming. So the people around here immediately protest and reject. Like, we've got historic Lakeview Cemetery across the street, which is enormous burial ground of 40,000 people or whatever it is. We don't need another one right here. And then it gets into property values and like, we bought houses here for the view and this and that. We don't want another cemetery. So right off the bat, it's like nobody wants the thing. But it was originally going to be a large private cemetery with a Grand Army plot in the middle. It was originally named Grand Army Cemetery, which I think is just maybe a little bit of a brand deal, like why you name a football stadium, you know, to get the sponsorship and the name on there. They donated this section to the Grand Army of the Republic, used the name, but to develop their private cemetery. There's a few Grand Army of the Republic cemeteries around Washington and Oregon, and they're all the same, where there's a Grand Army section. They get to use the prestige of the name at that time, and then it's a large private cemetery.
They're franchising.
Yeah, exactly. But the ownership of the cemetery struggled. They wound up selling it off in pieces, and it eventually shrank down to the size that's here today. But it was still, the veterans were aging. The cemetery itself was kind of falling into disrepair because the people who own the property weren't really succeeding as a cemetery business, because everybody wanted to be in Lakeview. That's the prestigious place to be buried. It got to the point where they were going to sell off the adjacent property, which is, you can see this hedgerow that goes around here, for houses to be developed right up to the very borders of this cemetery. And at that point, in 1924, some of the surviving Union veterans of the Grand Army that were quite passionate about preserving this place organized to get it purchased and ownership taken by the city of Seattle, and it is currently a City of Seattle park. Again, the ownership and responsibility of the aging Grand Army of the Republic men. They had hired the cemetery across the street to take care of it until they ran out of money for that. The City of Seattle's not in the cemetery business. They're in the parks business. So they would run a lawnmower through here. But waves of long decade or 15 years of neglect, followed by a peak of like, hey, we got to fix this place up and save it, much like what happened to really preserve it most recently about 20 years ago to the condition we see it now, happens repeatedly from 1897 every 10 years through its entire existence. Is neglect. Oh my God, this is an embarrassment to the city, let's fix it up, let's honor the veterans, and then another 10 years of neglect. That's the quick version of the cycles of who's responsible for caring for this place, and then being forgotten about, and then getting some effort.
And you'd mentioned angry neighbors once upon a time, but today the neighbors are actually pretty good to this cemetery.
Yes, yeah. The cemetery, the reason, a good portion of why it was really preserved, a directed effort towards preservation of this place as an existing Seattle park, began in the late 1990s when there was a big movement from the city council to establish off-leash dog parks in a number of the cemetery, or a number of the parks around the city. This was on the short list of 11 city properties that were to be possibly designated as a potential off-leash park. So the neighbors here and in other neighborhoods all around the cities pushed back against that, and they organized a called the Friends of the Grand Army of the Republic Cemetery organization to really put some effort into realizing this as a neighborhood asset rather than an afterthought. So they got grants to do landscape architect, arborists to come in and take care of the historic trees. These trees, some of them are from saplings from Lincoln's birthplace in Kentucky that were brought here by the veterans. So there's a lot of history that was uncovered and preserved here. The park will come in here and they'll empty the garbage can, they'll run a lawnmower through here, they'll trim the hedges, but it's still neighborhood community organization volunteers that put up and down the flagpole every morning, that come and weed whack around here and do the little fine-tuning care for it. But they're really largely responsible, them and Sons of Union veterans and local roundtables and things in the late 90s, early 2000s to really bring this place back from the depths.
Last question. Of course, if I want to know more about Seattle's rich Civil War history, how can I find out?
Yeah, I would recommend look for Civil War Seattle on any social media. Facebook, of course, is a great place, but also on YouTube, TikTok. I'm very, very heavily active on that app. And my website, of course, which is a little light on content. I like to do a lot of in-person stuff. So I do have a history walking tour business here in Seattle. So it's Civil War Seattle walking tours. So that is where most of this information gets disseminated is in-person events and presentations and tours. But I am on every social media and my own website, civilwarseattle.com. And you can find some writing from me on ECW, and hopefully some more in the future with that too. So you can get a little Civil War fix, Civil War Seattle fix, right on emerging Civil War.
We're delighted to have you. Thanks for spending a little time with us.
Thanks, Chris.